we got all of our things getting set up here. Make sure we're all set up and ready to go. Unfortunately, I don't have my monitor and computer that I usually have to check on comments, so I apologize if I'm missing anything from anybody else's comments or anything like that. I'm going to try my best to make sure I pick up on all of those comments and other situations like it. So I appreciate if you stick with me on that one just to make sure. I don't plan to miss any of your comments, in other words, because I do appreciate them, and they definitely help as far as keeping up with the videos and really help with just comments in general. Because for my other brainstorm events I've done on YouTube and elsewhere, the comments have been a really huge help to monitor how the way I am thinking and other things relating to it, such as comment sections giving me ideas for chapters and other things relating to that. So again, I really appreciate it, and I don't plan to miss any of our comments or anybody that follows me on Twitch, YouTube, or anything else elsewhere. I do have a Twitch follower with Cassian, one of my friends. So I appreciate you following me, even though I might had to persuade you to do so. But any little bit counts, and you have to be I guess a little bit desperate at first. But before I get bogged down on all of the details with live streaming technology errors and other things, let's get to kind of the point of today's live stream. So this is my second video and live stream on the novel series I've done for my D-Live Roundtable Decision and my Twitch Roundtable Talk. And I've done about 7.5, really 8 live streams on my novel series as a whole. So those that are watching on my YouTube channel might see the title 7.5. So I thought I would quickly address that first. The reason I'm kind of calling it 7.5 is because the last live stream where I introduced the book to my readers but didn't really talk about it a whole lot due to Twitch and D-Live, not really readers, but anyway, to where I introduced them to my new audience. I didn't really go into depth what the book was about, but more wanted to say, hey, this is another thing I plan to do, and I hope you'll kind of follow me in my journey to do so, because I do think it's something a little bit different and something that I enjoy and I think others might enjoy as well. So I kind of briefly mentioned it, and I wouldn't really have called it a full episode, so this is why today's episode is more of a full episode, and I'm calling it the 7.5, addressing it. So really it's the 7th episode, but since I had it in the title before, anyway, you kind of get the point. But for the purpose of today's live stream, I'm going to talk a little bit about my planning of my book so far, and what I've written since yesterday, and what I've kind of planned out in my mind, and put a little bit more in writing for my next parts of the chapter. Because as I kind of explained on my several live streams, is that I'm not necessarily a person that's very easy to write and gets writing easily, or however else you might want to describe that. It's something that takes work, and I argue that a lot of good novelists and other writers and readers and other things, like anything, practice makes perfect. So the more you do it, the better you get at, and the faster you become at doing so. So that's kind of how I'm addressing the book series, and I know that I'm probably messing up a few things that people who are better readers or better writers might catch up on a little bit faster than I do, especially with spelling errors due to just me wanting to kind of get content out and my problems with being able to see them as a whole with the dyslexia and other things like it. But that's kind of how I've been addressing the series. But I thought I would talk a little bit about how I've kind of planned out the series and the castle that I mentioned on the last episode on Twitch and D-Live only, as I read out the 10.5 pages. So those that haven't seen that yet, especially on my Twitch channel, Roundtable Talk, you can watch the full episode or the full live stream where I read the 10.5 pages that I wrote as a scary story in my college experience. and I'm kind of turning it in that case it keeps the prologue and it gets written into a story, but I keep that as my content and my inspiration to continue out this story that's really not even close to a novel yet. It's not even really a chapter in. And I'm at the very beginning stage, and that's why I'm calling it brainstorming, because it still is a brainstorm although I'm writing out content. So you kind of get where I'm coming from there. So those that maybe are active viewers on my YouTube channel, that some of what I'm saying might be a little bit repetitive to what we've talked about and what I've said before, but I thought it would be a good idea to kind of talk about how I plan the castle and other things relating to it, despite other events from it. So a lot of what I've kind of planned to do is that, and as I mentioned before in my channels and other things relating to it, we're still good. As I mentioned on other things relating to it, a castle is something that is very important for a fantasy novel series. So being able to research certain castles is very important. And one of these castles that I'm inspiring my story on is the Dover Castle in the UK area. And essentially this castle was built with several walls and layers, as I kind of described in my chapter, but it was built off of a body of water. And I had the research document of Dover Castle pulled up, but it was on a separate document, and I realized I accidentally exited out of that document. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull up some pictures for you of what the Dover Castle looked like, and use kind of the same websites that I've used to build out my research document, because I do have a research document of of all the research, obviously, that I have going into this book, because as I mentioned, I do want this book to have some fantasy elements into it, because obviously we don't live in the medieval times, but at the same time I want the book to have a lot of truth and a lot of historical importance to it. And one of those events is basing castles off of certain actual castles that existed. So instead of making up a castle like a lot of fantasy genres do, because they're able to scale everything up and make it a lot more glamorous to look at, such as like the Lord of the Rings and other content like that, I wanted it more to be focused entirely on Dover castles, are real castles of events, and I might change certain aspects of the castle a little bit to make it a little more interesting or a little more intricate or anything like that. But a lot of times what actually had happened in history or has happened in history is just as magnificent as what a fantasy author or an author in general is able to make up in his mind. Especially with, I believe it was Stephen King, if I'm not mistaken, but he was saying that he couldn't even have envisioned what's happening right now in the world with COVID and a mass disease that almost wipes out, it's not like the Black Plague. Well, anyway, I don't want to get into all the numbers and politics behind COVID right now, but he was even saying that he couldn't even envision something like COVID happening in a fantasy series, yet it's happening right now. So it's hard to kind of make up events that are as good as what have happened in history or have happened in history. So that's why I'm kind of getting my inspiration with real life castles. And one of those castles and inspirations of my story that I'm going to highlight is the Dover Castle. And as the website pulls up, I'll go back to the image here. But the Dover Castle, as you can see, has its large walls that we always have envisioned castles to look like, but on the inside of the wall is the physical castle itself. So a lot of times in fantasy genres and like Disney and other things, you have the castle and it's huge and like acres wide, or just magnificently big. When in reality, in the medieval times, castles weren't necessarily super big because it had to be well maintained and only had a certain amount of population that physically lived inside the castle. So castles weren't always as huge as they look in movies, just to draw the people's attention to them. So as I was kind of saying, I might change a little bit of that, but as you can see from the picture, even though you don't get a full perspective of what it looks like, the castles aren't as huge as movies and other type of genres make them look. So you can kind of see from this viewpoint of the Dover Castle and what it looks like from the image it got took. And I'll go back to here just to briefly describe, and that's why I kind of want Dover Castle with this Wikipedia image you can see here, as it's next to the sea. And that is something I want this empire I'm building and basing the castle off of, such as the Dover Castle, to be built on the sea and to have a strong sea importance. Because as you saw briefly from the title of the article, it was its first line of defense due to its sea entry level. So it had its point of defense marked. So the only way to get into the place where a lot of enemies might have wanted to get into was through this Dover Castle port. And Dover Castle was sitting on there and had a strong importance to being able to let those they liked and those they didn't like through or not through the castle walls. But before I read the article, I'll quickly check comments just to make sure. And Ron Helton on YouTube says that is an impressive castle. Yeah, Dover Castle, when you kind of look at all the historical castles out there, it's one that gets mentioned the most. And it is a rather huge type of castle compared. Although I said it was small, it's small to our what we view castles like. So as I was kind of briefly saying, we tend to view castles as something that's huge. And yes, castles are huge compared to what, especially the medieval folk were living in, but it's not necessarily as big as what the fantasy genre makes them look like. So I feel like I've kind of explained that. But Dover Castle was one of those magnificent castles, and a real castle that it has existed and still exists that you can visit, that I'm basing this empire off of. And as it says here, Dover is one of Britain's greatest castles. Its clifftop location, overlooking the shortest crossings between England and France, has given it an immense strategic importance. And as a result, its defense have been rebuilt and adapted over the centuries to meet the changing needs of warfare. Spend a large day, and there you will discover 2,000 years of military building, from Iron Age to earthworks to Cold War tunnels. The importance of the site wasn't lost on the Romans. And the lighthouse they built on the heights to guide their ships into the harbor below still stands within the castle walls. It's the most complete standing Roman building in England. The upper part dates from the 13th century, when it served as a bell tower for the adjacent Anglo-Saxon church. The church was heavily restored in Victorian times, but some Saxon features remain, notably the new blocked south door. Although William the Conqueror built a wooden castle at Dover, the first major construction in stone dates from the region of Henry II, who spent a vast amount of money building the certain walls and the huge great tower. Clearly, this monumental 25-acre high structure could have been used as a place of refuge in an event of attack, but it was also a statement of royal power, a comfortable lodging, and an impressive place in which to entertain English heritage. As recreated, the lavish interiors and brightly colored decorations that would have greeted visitors at the time. Other buildings did not have purely military purpose. The remarkable arched towers on the eastern battlements were constructed in the 1180s to cover a relatively weak spot on the castle perimeter and feature over 50 crossbow loops and 2 tiers. These defenses would have soon been put to the test when King John also spent money on the castle. Rigged on Magna Carta, many of his barons rebelled and invited Prince Louis of France to replace him, but Dover remained loyal to John and successfully held out against Louis. Even though the French succeeded in undermining the castle main gatehouse after the siege, it was blocked and replaced by the Constable Gate, now the castle's main entrance. Note how the approach to this runs parallel to the main defenses. exposing an attacker to the flanking fire from the castle walls. Meanwhile, additional defenses were built outside the O Gate, linked to the main castle by a tunnel you can still explore. When troops were massed here to guard against the threat of a French invasion at the end of the 18th century, further tunnels were dug to serve as barracks. These tunnels were used again during the Second World War to house a hospital, and it was also from here that Vice Admiral Ramsay organized Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of British troops from Dunkirk in 1940. During the Cold War, the tunnels were severely converted into a regional seat of the government, tasked with the unbelievable job of organizing life in an event of a nuclear attack. You can visit the tunnels by joining one of the regular guided tours. One takes you into the underground hospital, which has been faithfully recreated, while the other tells the story of Dunkirk through special effects and film, and incorporates visit to wartime operation rooms and telephone exchange. So as you can see, it served a massive importance in history, not just in the medieval times when it was originally built, but also later on. And I'm not so much going to talk about later on, but I felt like it was important to read out the entire article to get a full grasp of just how important this castle was, or how well constructed the castle was. Because a lot of people talk about Roman ingenuity and say that they built roads so fast and built bridges so fast and built just buildings as a whole so fast compared to everyone else, especially at that time. And even now, looking back at how everything was done, you can tell just how magnificent and how amazing that would have been to discover something like Dover Castle and build it to such a good, high-standing importance. Interesting. So the English Heritage article isn't pulling up right now, but that was another article I talked about with Dover Castle, where it kind of talked a little bit about what each room was in the castle wall of Dover Castle specifically. But a lot of castles kind of had the same sort of rooms, standings as Dover Castle. And I'll check on the comment section briefly here. And hey, John, I haven't seen you in a while. Thank you for joining, but it's unfortunate I'm not that one article isn't pulling up, because I was going to mention something in the article and give credit for it. But as I was kind of saying, a lot of the castle walls, especially at the time, were built with certain main importance having to be placed on the buildings inside the castle. And, you can obviously have the castle, what we view it as, like the large throne room, and maybe you view other things relating to it. But a lot of times castles either show the main keeps where the royals stayed, such as the king, queen, and maybe some higher guardsmen and other things. And then you see the throne room, and those are kind of the only rooms that get explored within a castle. But that's not necessarily all what the castles have in it. As you saw, the article before this mentioned the barricades and other things relating to trading soldiers and other things that every castle had in some extent, but Dover Castle also had that same sort of room guidance. So I was just pulling up this article because I looked at it earlier today, and it kind of shows a few different viewpoints of Dover Castle. I believe this was the Wikipedia article picture where you see the sea in the back and then the Dover Castle built upon a hill. And that's a real quick thing to mention, although I think a lot of people understand the importance of warfare being built where you're higher up. So in other words, you want to shoot down at people instead of having to shoot up at somebody. If you have the higher ground, you have the higher chance of winning that battle, winning that scenario, and moving on. And that's very important. And most castles were built on a strategic location, either being built by a hill or against a hill or against a mountain, something where they're strategically placed to where it gives them some defense instead of just being built in the middle of a field where there's not really any other scenarios that were good for the castle to stand by itself. But you also see how the walls were built from that thick stone, and most of the stone at the time was like an ashlar stone, and this stone is hard to break through, and at the time there wasn't too many weapons that could physically break through a castle wall, so it stood as its great defense and everything against those who wanted to try to get in. So that's kind of all I was going to mention on Dover Castle, as it being related to the type of castle I want to talk about. And I guess I'll go ahead and pull up that article, because I do think, or pull up my research page. I don't know why I exited out of it, but I'm gonna go ahead and pull that out here. I wanted to show a few things relating to it. But I'll check comment sections while that loads. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and move on. I might go back to it just to kind of see. Alright. So that kind of brings you up to date on what I wanted to mention with the castles and other things relating to it. So I read out this first couple of paragraphs I have for the chapter in my last stream, and I kind of stopped at the point where I needed to figure out what I was going to do with with Leo Smith looking different than John Smith, the main household figure of the village folk or of the peasant folk, although the Smith household does hold a higher standing compared to the other households from it. So that is something I was going to briefly describe and then compare to the average folk of what somebody in the medieval times at this castle would have experienced. So I decided to, what I wrote for today and what I've kind of brainstormed in my head was this. So I described Leo compared to John Smith, and that they both had strikingly black, thick, curly yet short hair. They both stood out with their blackish brown eyes and slight hints of green. And, I added a few more vivid verbs here and there. But I wanted to describe their most noticeable difference. So I decided to go with this so far and what I've kind of written since the last time we talked. And I said, the most notable difference can be seen in the light or darkness. The incident claimed Leo's hand and casted a dark shadow only the sea knew to be true. All the village folk knew were Leo's screams as the waves rowed him closer to the land, and Leo never said a word about what happened. The village gave Leo an underground nickname, only whispered, and haven't thought of a nickname yet, as you can see by the red. And then I say, Isabel, the daughter of the Smith household, a put-together yet shy, only speaking in the softness of tones. So that's how I quickly wanted to mention Isabel, but I also need to think of a nickname. And as I discussed on my last stream, and as I've thought about in my head and other things relating to it, I was thinking about what I want this incident to be. And I don't want it to be too similar to Game of Thrones, as obviously that's where I'm getting that's where I'm getting my inspiration from. But it's important you don't steal ideas from other things, because I do want to be original in the story I'm making and in the content that I'm trying to produce. So I'm kind of thinking that I want his injury to either be on his arm or his hand, and I don't necessarily want it to be a scar, but something a little bit different. So the running idea I have in my head so far is a fish hook or something related to it, maybe a metal piece off of a spear or something, has gotten stuck in his hand or stuck in his arm and can't be removed without, serious injury being inflicted. And that will be kind of his most noticeable difference. And people are whispering about the nickname relating to that injury or the nickname he gets from it. basically him not saying anything, but maybe a lot of conspiracy within the townsmen folk of what exactly happened on that night. But nobody ever is going to know the story from Leo's mouth because he doesn't dare to talk about what might have happened. So I'm thinking a nickname's going to be either directly related to an injury on his hand, or a nickname relating to him not saying anything, or a nickname about his personality more than about his injury, but they only whisper it to not be heard by Leo or heard by the Smith household, because the Smiths are generally held at a higher regard compared to the other townsmen folk. So that's kind of the running idea I have going in my head so far. I'll take a quick drink and we'll continue on with what I was kind of thinking. I'm going to check the section one more time here. Oh, I am getting a call. 1 second here. Sorry about that. You can't just completely ignore your mother. That is not something that's going to give you very good standing. So I went ahead and talked to, or texted her just to make sure it was nothing urgent. And if she says, I'll end the stream real quick. But it doesn't look like it's going to be. Well, we're good. Okay. Sorry about that. Nobody likes radio silence, but again, I don't want to ignore that. Alrighty, so this kind of leads me to where I might have left off on my last YouTube stream, but I kind of wanted to work back a little bit and think about what I've written in the past. So, and I also wanted to think about how I wanted to start my Twitch and DLive content about the novel Brainstorm. Because this last thing I'm going to discuss is something I have discussed on my YouTube channel, but I do think that my Twitch and DLive audience might want to know it as well. So I decided I was going to talk about it a little bit today, and then I was going to think and write a little bit at the end, and we'll see how it goes from there. I don't know if this live stream is going to be as long as my other ones, but time will tell, and we'll see. But again, I apologize for that. So I pulled up an article on my last YouTube stream because one of the most important things I need to discuss and write about, and something I do want to be truthful within my content, is pacing things off of what have happened in history. And I've said that before, but I especially want the clothing and the type of clothing that were worn in the medieval times to be the same type of clothing I have in my book. So I don't necessarily think that that's something that needs to be changed, even if it could be changed in other type of novel books. And I pulled up another article, I believe it was this one here. Yeah, it was this one here, where it mentioned the women's clothing and mentioned a lot of descriptive words and advert or descriptive words about the type of clothing women of the medieval times were to wear. And most of it I didn't know how to pronounce and had to look up afterward to kind of figure out fully what the article was saying. So I researched in my own time and pulled up these articles that I'm going to talk about in this live stream as well, about what clothing in general was worn in the medieval times. And that's something that I'm going to put in my research document later on about what type of clothing was worn. But before I just babble on about the same thing, I'll go ahead and start this. Most people in the Middle Ages wore woolen clothing with undergarments, if any, made of linen. Along the Patienary wool was generally shorn from the sheep and spun into the thread of the cloth by the women of the family. Dyes were common, so even the lower class peasants frequently wore colorful clothing using plants, roots, lichen, tree bark, nuts, crushed insects, molluscs, I probably butchered that, and iron oxide. Virtually every color could be achieved. Dyes came from different sources, some of them from more expensive than others. Even the humble peasant could have been colorful clothing. Dyed fabric would fade it if it was not mixed with mordant. Bolder sheets required either longer dyeing for times or more expensive dyes. Fabrics are the brightest and richest colors, cost more and were therefore most often found on nobility and the very rich. Brighter colors, better materials, and longer jacket length were usually signs of greater wealth. Men wore stockings, hose, and tunics. Notable wore tunics or jackets with hose, leggings, and breeches. And wealthy also wore furs and jewelry. Women wore long gowns with sleeveless tunics and wimples to cover their hair. Sheepskin cloaks with woolen hats and mittens were worn in winter for protection from the cold and rain. Women wore flowing gowns and elaborate headwear ranging from headdresses shaped like hearts or butterflies to tall-shaped caps and Italian turbans. Throughout much of the Middle Ages and in most societies, undergarments worn by both men and women didn't substantially change. They consisted of a shirt or under tunic, stockings or hose, and for men at least underpants. Luminance, woodcuts, and other period artwork illustrate medieval people in bed or different attire. Some are unclothed, but just as many are wearing simple gowns or shirts, some with sleeves. We have virtually no documentation regarding what people wore to bed, but from those images it is clearly that those who wore night dresses would have been clad in an under tunic, possibly the same one they've worn during the day. Leather boots were covered with wooden paddings to keep the feet dry. Outer clothes were almost never lunched, but then linen underwear was regularly washed. The smell of wood smoke that permeated the clothing seemed to act as a deodorant. Clothing of the aristocrat and wealthy merchants tended to elaborate the changed and according to the decades of fashion. Fur was often used to line the garments of the wealthy. Jewelry was lavish, much of it imported. Gem cutting had not been invented until the 15th century, so most stones were not lustrous. Ring brooches were the most popular item from the 12th century. Diamonds became popular in Europe in the 14th century. By the mid-14th century, there were laws to control who wore what jewelry. Knights were not permitted to wear rings. Sometimes clothes were garnished with silver, but only the wealthy could wear such items. Virtually everyone wore something on their heads in the Middle Ages to keep off the sun in hot weather, to keep their hands warm in cold weather, and to keep the dirt out of their hair. As with other type of garment, hats could indicate a person's job or situation in life, could make a fashion statement. Hats were especially important. To knock someone's hat off his head or her head was a grave insult that, depending on the circumstances, could even be considered assault. Types of men's hat included the wide-brimmed straw hats, close-fitted coufs, I know I butchered that, I've seen it before, of linen or hemp that tied under the chin like a bonnet, and a wide variety of felt caps. Women wore veils and wimples, along with the fashion-conscious nobility of the high Middle Ages. Both men and women wore hoods, sometimes attached to capes or jackets, but sometimes standing alone. Some of them wore completed men's hats, wore hoods with a long strip of fabric in the back that could be wound around the head. A common adornment for men for the working class was a hood attached to a short cape that covered just the shoulders. Most of the holy orders wore long woolen habits and emblem of Roman clothing. Saint Benedict started that a monk's hat should be plain but comfortable, and they were allowed to wear linen coifs to keep their heads warm. Benedicts wore black with the something underwool are white. Silk was the most luxurious fabric available to medieval Europeans, and it was costly that so. Repeat. Silk was the most luxurious fabric available to medieval Europeans, and it was so costly that only the upper classes and churchmen could afford it. While its beauty made it highly prized status symbol, silk has practical aspects that made it much sought after. It is lightweight yet strong, resists soil, has excellent dyeing properties, and is cool and comfortable in warmer weather. Western Europeans imported silks from Byzantium, but also import them from India and the Far East. Whatever it came from, the fabrics were so costly it was reversed for church, cemetery, and cathedral decorations. Muslims who had conquered Persia and acquired the secret of silk brought the knowledge to Sicily and Spain. From there it would spread to Italy. By the 13th century, European silk was competing successfully with Byzantine products. For most of the Middle Ages, silk production spread no further in Europe until factories were set up in France in the 15th century. Laws dating back to the Romans restricted ordinary people and their expenditure. Those were called sumptuary laws. The word sumptuary is derived from the Latin word of expenditure. So I'm going to stop again, just make sure I didn't miss anybody's comments. And Ron says, consider it assault if the hat knocked off belonged to a bald man. Lo, maybe. The closest Catholic church here is named St. Benedict. Yeah, I think St. Benedict is actually a rather common church name, but that's kind of funny. So I'll continue on a little bit more in this article. This article does go on a pretty long ways, and that's why I kind of found the article very useful for what I plan to do from it, because it is descriptive in some of the aspects it uses for describing what women and men wore, as well as the social standing, and the whole hat thing I thought was rather funny, and the fact that you brought up the joke of it as well was funny to me as well. But so anyway, I'll keep continuing here. Sumptuary laws might apply to food, beverages, furniture, jewelry, and clothing. These laws were used to control behavior and ensure that a specific class structure was maintained. Penalties for violating sumptuary laws could be harsh: fines, the loss of property, title, and even life. The first record of sumptuary legislation is the Ordinance of the City of London in 1281, which regulated the apparel of clothing of workmen. These related to workers who had working clothes supplied by their employers as part of their wages. The second record of sumptuary legislation occurred during the reign of King Edward II, related to food expenditure. King Edward II issued a proclamation against outrageous consumption of meats and fine dishes by nobles. The next record of sumptuary legislation occurred during the reign of King Edward III. King Edward III passed 3 sumptuary laws to regulate the dress of various classes of English people, promote English garments, and to preserve class justifications by means to costume. And then it briefly talks about that. But the last part that was mentioned in the article isn't something that really fits the time period I want to cover in my story. So that brings me to, in general, when you just search on Google Images, what did girls wear in the medieval times, you obviously have the article mentioned here, and you have some other type of clothing. And knowing Google, there's probably going to be something else popping up here and there that's not even related to medieval clothing and any genre. So I kind of was looking at that as well, because I do want my character Isabel to fit a rather accurate approach to what was being worn in the medieval times. And that was one thing I wanted to talk about. But before I go back to the article, I'm going to check one more time, make sure I don't miss anyone's comments, and make sure we are all good. And it's frozen. I'm refreshing DLive here. And yeah, we're still good. We're looking good here. Alrighty. Alrighty, I'll go back to here. And I apologize for all the bouncing around, but I don't want to miss anyone's comments, because I do greatly appreciate them. And normally I'll have my monitor, so being able to bounce around the two is something that I do find very important. Sorry, that was my yeah, I'm gonna I'm gonna have to cut the stream a little shorter than I wanted it to be, but without fully defined, at least for Isabel's character, by next week. But what I kind of want to do is to find out Isabel's character through what she looks like and certain aspects of how she dresses and how she acts and other things like it. And then I want to talk about my next bullet point, and that is comparing it to the poor of the village, and then go back to comparing it to the rich and the royal's life and other things like that. But unfortunately, I'm going to have to kind of end the stream now to make sure we're all good there. And I appreciate those who have all commented, and I apologize that this one's a little shorter. But again, thank you, Ron, for following me on DLive. I just saw that. I highly appreciate that. I'm really wanting to boost up my DLive and Twitch, as well as my YouTube, of course. I'm definitely too small to kind of get removed from the platform, I would say, but I don't like some of what YouTube is doing. And I'm going to have a live stream later in this week about more politics side of it and more philosophy type of side compared to my novel stream. And I don't have a date necessarily for that as well, but at the latest it's going to be on the weekend, and at the earliest it might be on Thursday. And I think I probably want to do it Thursday more than the weekend, but we'll see. I apologize that I'm going to have to end the video here, and I'll have my next live stream about this novel series on Tuesday for my YouTube, Twitch, and DLive. And thanks again for those who have commented on and watched it now, and those who might watch it later. I highly appreciate all of you, and catch you the next time.